How's the royal family? I pray that everyone is doing well. Well, my royal family, this is going to be a long video. And turn out that this video is going to be a spiritual video. And I know some people may know by now. And let me go over here real quick. Let's see here. Which one do I want to show? Let me see here. Is it that one? No, here it is. I'll read this to y'all real quick. Iran warns of consequences after U.S. strike in Iraq and Syria. So, while I was doing some really deep research, I'm a person that is really deep into prophecy. I love going over prophecy because I like to know where we're at in this spiritual walk and where we're at as far as we knowing that, Babylon is systematically being tore down. And that's just the things that I am interested in, because I often say everything that we will see will be in biblical proportions. So first and foremost, I thought I was going to just, do what I normally do. But I really do truly do videos based on emotions. Because I'm observing things, because me personally, just for individual, if I'm constantly doing videos, I don't think I can put out the quality of videos. If some people can do it, like Lisa, she can pump them out like that in their quality. So we all have our special way of doing these things. So I'm often observing right along with the royal family. Then you got other people, they just trying to get it out real fast. And then they have to go say, I apologize. This blah, blah happened and all of that kind of stuff. And basically what I'm doing, whatever is happening, I like the story to take a journey before I tackle it. So, some things I'm going to read to the royal family. And this particular link that I have here for y'all, you see where it says Bible prophecy, Syria and Iraq, prophecies of Syria. And I'm going to read some things, not all of it, but was absolutely, there was a point that I stopped. And I didn't go all over the place, but I just kind of knew where to stop at. And y'all will feel me in just a bit. So, I'm reading from my laptop, and most people know why. I'm dyslexic. And let me show y'all something. See, when the sentences is too close like that for a person that's dyslexic, it will overlap. And so it's good for us to, it's good to have, if you have it, I can read it on my laptop and blow it up more. And I do proofread too. So that helps too as well. So, first thing, Damascus will one day be utterly destroyed. Many historians believe Damascus may be the oldest continuing inhabited city in the world, and there is no record in ancient history of it ever being fully destroyed. Syria is almost a city-state with much of its population living in and around the city of Damascus. Syria, like the rest of Israel, Islamic neighbors hate Israel and has publicly called for the destruction of Israel. Syria has also, for the first time in history, recently formed a strategic military alliance. Forgive me, that's a tongue twister for me. With both Russia and Iran, with their armies currently taking up battle positions along Syria's border with Israel. Turkey has also recently formed a military alliance with Russia and is holding high-level military cooperations meetings with Iran. An article from Israel recently reported Iran now has at least 13 permanent military bases in Syria. It is interesting to note in the 1973, Yom Kippur, that's the best I can say that, war, Israel considered using nuclear weapons against their enemies when early in the war it appeared Israel would be overrun and defeated by the invading Islamic army. Okay. So it says here, Damascus, Syria, will someday be utterly destroyed and will become a ruinous heap. The burden of Damascus, behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. Isaiah 17:1. This prophecy has never yet been fulfilled. It is also notable that Syria, or its ancient name, Aram, is not listed among the Russia-Iran alliance, which will attack and invade Israel in Ezekiel 38. It may be this prophecy concerning the destruction of Damascus will be fulfilled just prior to Russia-Iran invasion, or could even possibly be the catalyst for this coming Russia-Iran invasion of Israel. The Bible then goes on to warn this prophecy will be fulfilled during a time of great trouble for nation Israel. And in that day it shall come to pass, the glory of Jacob, Israel, shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall vix lean. Isaiah 17:4. There will be a coming time of trouble unlike anything in history of the nation coming to the land of Israel. Jeremiah calls it the time of Jacob's Israel trouble. Jeremiah 37. It is hard to tell if this happens after Damascus is destroyed or at the same time. We do know from Bible prophecy there will be a coming 3.5-year period of false peace in Israel, bought in by a strong, powerful, and very popular world leader, also called the Antichrist, who will someday enforce a covenant or peace plan upon nation Israel, which will mark the exact beginning of the coming 7th year apocalypse. We are told here in the other passage that a remnant in Israel will turn back to Yah and his word around the time of Armageddon, as they come to believe from Scripture that Yahweh is the eternal one, for of old, from everlasting. And then they say, see, what's that? Micaiah 5:2. I may be pronouncing that wrong. That's Michah. The Messiah and the Holy One of Israel. And at that day shall a man look to his Maker, and his eyes shall have respect to the Holy One, Messiah of Israel. Isaiah 17:7. Okay, I'm going to leave it right there, my royal family. Forgive me if I didn't pronounce all the words right, but I did my very best, and I put my heart into it. So, there's a lot of drama popping off in that region, and we're going to continue to go on this journey. See here, let me refresh this. That's the best way to do it. Okay.
Officials say U.S. forces conducted strikes in Iraq and Syria against 5 facilities that were tied to an Iran-backed militia. The targets were blamed, or at least connected to, a series of attacks on joint U.S.-Iraq military facilities housing American forces. CNN's Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr joins me now from Washington with more. These strikes are the first significant military response and retaliation with these attacks, which targeted American personnel on the ground, correct?
That's right, Martin. This has all been going on for several weeks. The U.S. says that an Iranian-backed militia group that's been operating in Iraq and Syria is responsible for a number of rocket and mortar attacks against locations where U.S. troops are in Iraq. And actually on Friday, one of these attacks was in the death of a U.S. civilian contractor. So the U.S. has been looking for some time now what its response should be and what they want to do. And this morning, Washington time, 7 o'clock in the evening on the ground in Iraq, U.S. F-15s conducted strikes against 5 facilities in Iraq and Syria operated by this militia group that the U.S. says are responsible for these attacks. The targets were command and control and weapons storage ammo sites. So what they were going after really was the capability for any additional strikes by this militia group to happen. They did report there were a number of secondary explosions at these ammo sites. So they do believe, for the moment at least, they got to this. You know, if one is practically minded, it doesn't ever really go away, but they're hoping they've at least pushed back the capability of this group. And to answer the obvious question, will the U.S. conduct more strikes? Officials tell us it's hard to say. They want to see what the Iranian response is to all of this and whether this group really pulls back or not. But President Trump has made it clear that he will not tolerate attacks against U.S. forces. So the U.S. swinging into action with these strikes in the last several hours.
All right. Stay with us, Barbara. Let me bring in Jeremy Diamond. Jeremy, Russian President Vladimir Putin, I'm told, spoke on the phone to the president, quote, to discuss matters of mutual interest and counterterrorism. Do we know any more about this conversation?
Well, we don't know whether the president actually discussed this particular set of strikes with the Russian president. We do know that, according to the Russian readout of that call, that it was, at least in part, about U.S. intelligence that helped foil a terrorist plot in St. Petersburg in Russia. But what we do know about these strikes today, Martin, is that it took place at 11 a.m. Eastern time while the president was actually at his golf course. We actually spotted him a couple hours later actually on the golf course golfing. We don't know whether at that time while the strikes were taking place, whether the president was perhaps in a secure facility at the golf club or if he was indeed on the golf course while those strikes were indeed taking place. But we are also now expecting the president to meet later today with his top foreign policy and defense officials, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, as well as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley. They are all en route, we are told, and expected to arrive at Mar-a-Lago today to brief the president and to further discuss these strikes that took place in Iraq and Syria. That is according to a source familiar and an administration official who spoke with me and our colleague Barbara Starr. So again, this is clearly something that the president is still monitoring, something that is still very much a developing situation. And it does appear that the tipping point for these strikes was indeed this attack that took place on Friday, where you saw one U.S. defense contractor who was killed, 4 U.S. troops who were wounded in attacks carried out by Iranian proxies in Iraq. Following that, you saw statements from some Republicans, including Republican Senator Tom Cotton, a hawkish ally of the president's in the Senate, who called for retaliation from the United States against Iran. It is interesting, of course, that the president's course of retaliation here was focused on attacking those Iranian proxies and not Iran itself. Of course, those Iranian proxies are the ones that the U.S. says is responsible for many of those attacks on Iraqi bases where U.S. troops are housed. But of course, we know that in the past, the president has considered retaliation directly against Iran. And again, as he sits down today with his top military and foreign policy officials, that is certainly something that we expect the president will be discussing. Martin?
Barbara, officials say that the Pentagon had a plan and brought it to the president Saturday for approval. So this was not just a spur of the moment, target of opportunity kind of thing.
That's right, Martin. It wasn't, because over the last several weeks there had been repeated attacks against these sites in Iraq where U.S. troops are located. And intelligence officials, when they looked at the kind of ordnance that was being fired, the kind of weapons being used, they say they had every reason to believe it was this Iranian-affiliated group operating inside Iraq, and that they warned them, don't do this. The message had been very clear. So the military doesn't wait to be asked. They always have a plan for everything, right? Mm-hmm. So clearly they had a plan. They knew where these sites were, and they were ready to go when it became a decision that the president made. And I think Jeremy's right. It was the death of the U.S. contractor on Friday and the multiple U.S. military wounded. Up until that point, we don't have any information that there had been any significant injuries in the previous attacks. But now, with someone being killed and multiple wounded, it seemed to have all changed, and it became necessary to take it to the president, say, this is what we want to do, get his okay, and then move very quickly today on these strikes.
Well, did y'all hear the reason why they doing this? They claiming they doing this? But we looking at it on a spiritual tip. So they all up in their feelings, supposedly because of a couple of contractors. And, when your ass is over there, some people may be touched. But it's much deeper than that. And I know the royal family know. And I know the Bible scholars are going to put them scriptures in there. And I need guidance, because y'all know I'm new to all of this. So as we continue on, Iran warns of consequences after U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria. There was a warning. But America ain't gonna listen to nothing, because America wants to flex its muscles and try to look like they the end all be all. Want to give the appearance of strength.
Overnight, Iranian-backed militia in Iraq now calling for U.S. forces to be pushed out of that country. This comes after a series of U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria targeting these militias. CNN's Ara Damon is live in Istanbul with the very latest, rising tensions in an already tense region.
Yeah, and that might even be an understatement, John, given how serious the situation is, with Iraq basically telling both Washington and Tehran to stop using it as a proxy battlefield. Iran also has now warned of grave consequences following these strikes, which, according to the Pentagon, targeted 5 areas, 3 of them in Iraq, 2 of them in Syria. The Pentagon saying that they were going after arms depots, weapons depots, as well as command and control centers belonging to this Shia militia known as Kata'ib Hezbollah. It is backed by Iran and was in fact one of the militias that the U.S. put under this umbrella called the special groups that were especially active in targeting the U.S. military back during the days of the U.S.-led occupation of Iraq. The militia itself has said that at least some 25 people were killed, another 51 injured in these strikes. They put out a statement calling on their forces to begin preparing and planning for more operations to push, as they said, the enemy America out of the country. Now, Iraq's caretaker Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi has called these strikes a violation of Iraq's sovereignty. He was informed that the strikes would take place about half an hour before they did. He then asked that the U.S. restrain. America, however, as we know, did not, and he is warning of a grave escalation. Now, the U.S. has come close to retaliating against Iran in the past. If you'll remember, there were those strikes against oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, and then Iran's downing of a U.S. drone. America, however, did restrain itself on those occasions. In this case, these particular attacks were in response to an attack outside of Kirkuk on a facility that was housing U.S. military personnel that ended up killing one U.S. contractor. Of course, the great concern in all of this is that if this situation escalates, that is detrimental not just to the stability of Iraq, but that of the region as a whole.
Arwa, thank you very much. And the broader picture here and the stability of the region is critical. Let's talk to CNN military and diplomatic analyst Rear Admiral John Kirby. He is, of course, former press secretary at the Pentagon as well. Good morning to you. We'll get to the stability question in the region in a moment, but just talking about this group, because this is a group responsible for 11 rocket attacks in 2 months, places where Americans are based in Iraq. The attack, the most recent one in Kirkuk, killed a U.S. contractor, wounded 4 American troops. Explain the significance of these strikes.
Well, what these the airstrikes by the U.S. were meant to retaliate against this group and their ability to conduct these kinds of attacks in the future. So they hit ammunition facilities, they hit a command and control facility, all trying to take out their ability to do this again, and also to send a very strong message that we're not gonna accept it. Now we have to see what the reaction is. I mean, this group is supported by Iran through their proxy organizations. So we'll have to see, how not only the militia groups react, but how Iran reacts as well.
I wonder what your read is on the Wall Street Journal editorial board writing, Trump finally fires back Iran. Let me read part of their opinion piece that struck me. Quote, "It's about time," they write, "Mr. Trump's reluctance to use force in response to previous Iranian attacks is one reason why General Soleimani, of course the Quds force, may feel that he can get away with more attacks." Do you agree, and will these strikes from the U.S. now deter any future potential attacks?
Well, certainly we're meant to deter. I think that's a very open question, Poppy, whether or not they'll be successful. I suspect Iran will try to respond in some way. It most likely won't be in kind, but what we'll have to see. And look, and I understand where the Wall Street Journal is coming from. The president has shown more restraint than I think some people would like him to have shown in going after Iran in the past. This one is a little different, though. We're not talking about them shooting down a drone or attacking tankers. We're talking about Shia-backed, Iranian-backed Shia militias. So not Iranian forces, not Iranian armed forces, but militias on the ground. And this strike was very proportional. They struck at facilities that they know were involved in those prior 11 rocket attacks that we've seen over the last 2 months. So it was very proportional, very discreetly done.
Listen to this from Defense Secretary Mark Esper. He was speaking yesterday and notably did not rule out further action. Here he was.
I would note also that we will take additional actions as necessary to ensure that we act in our own self-defense and we deter further bad behavior from militia groups or from Iran.
What does that tell you, Admiral Kirby, about where the administration's mindset is now? Because the Wall Street Journal was referencing the fact that they did not respond in June after the drone was downed or after the Saudi oil field attacked back in September.
Yeah, so the key phrase in what that the clip you just showed was "as necessary." So I suspect what's happening now is U.S. Central Command, in charge of our forces in the region, are looking at their force protection measures and taking necessary precautions to increase it as appropriate, including perhaps even force posture changes we don't know right now. But they're getting ready for whatever reaction that ought to come from Iran. I think there is very little appetite by this administration and certainly by the military to escalate this further. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about escalation, it was the Iranian, the Shia-backed militias really that have been the ones escalating, the level of tension over the last couple of months.
Absolutely. Finally, before you go, what is your take on the response from Iraq's prime minister, calling it a violation of Iraq's sovereignty? As we understand it, there was no coordination with Iraq, but they were notified before the strikes. What do you make of this?
Well, two things. One, I mean, they've got their own domestic politics to deal with. They've had huge protests by a disaffected young population in Iraq that accuses their government of corruption and mismanagement. So they have a domestic issue there to deal with. They also want to keep a good relationship with Iran. That's their neighbor. The prime minister and the government are Shia, so they are tied, at least from a religious perspective, to Iran. They know they have to have that relationship in good standing. But I found it ironic that the Iraqi prime minister is accusing the Americans of violating their sovereignty when A, we're on the ground at their request to help support them in their fight against ISIS, and B, they haven't said boo about the Iranian support for militia groups inside their country, which has been firing on those very same coalition forces that they want to be there. So I find it highly ironic.
Admiral Kirby, thank you.
All right, my royal family. What a mess. What a mess. Now, what I was thinking about, my royal family, was what Lisa had told me about Iran, and that once America and Iran really get to business and be about that life, that this country is not going to win the war. And America likes to flex her military power, and they look down and don't show respect to these other countries. But even deeper than that, we'll know where we're at whenever it goes down. You don't have to try to predict these things, because one thing, I see some people that try to do it. They try to predict when the Creator or the Messiah is fully present, even though they are present. But you know what I mean, fully present, and we don't know the moment, the day, or the hour. The angels don't know at all. But how I look at these prophecies is about getting our house in order. It's like, okay, this is the benchmark right here. And there may be some things, some housekeeping and things we need to take care of. So I have one more video. It's a short one, but it's necessary. So they're claiming again, U.S. conducts airstrikes. Ain't that something? They conduct airstrikes. And so this is all behind a contractor. American. Troops injured. You are in, you okay. Let's put the contractor to the side. So they doing all of this because a handful of troops, that's what you sign up for, being in the military. But let me reserve myself, play this little 2-minute video so I can close this thing out. Okay, let's see here. Let's get it going. Let me blow it up.
The State Department saying those airstrikes sent a stark message to Iran that we will not tolerate actions that put Americans at risk.
This was a defensive action designed to protect American forces and American citizens in Iraq. And it was aimed also at deterring Iran. It took a strike at an American facility. President Trump's been pretty darn patient, and he's made clear
that we will not tolerate.
Bear with me, family. The volume was low. Let me start it back over. Okay, let's get rolling with it.
The State Department saying those airstrikes sent a stark message to Iran that we will not tolerate actions that put Americans at risk.
This was a defensive action designed to protect American forces and American citizens in Iraq. And it was aimed also at deterring Iran. It took a strike at an American facility. President Trump's been pretty darn patient, and he's made clear at the same time that when Americans' lives were at risk, we would respond, and that's what the Department of Defense did yesterday.
Lucas Tomlinson's live at the Pentagon with more. Lucas?
Eric, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said U.S. Air Force jets, F-15 Strike Eagles, dropped laser-guided bombs on those targets in western Iraq and Syria.
Strikes were successful. The pilots and aircraft returned back to base safely. We will take additional actions as necessary to ensure that we act in our own self-defense and we deter further bad behavior from militia groups or from Iran.
The Pentagon released this drone video of the strikes. The U.S. Air Force jets dropped 250 and 500-pound GPS-guided bombs on the 5 targets, 3 in western Iraq, 2 in eastern Syria. The strikes were retribution for a rocket attack in Kirkuk in northern Iraq Friday, which killed an American defense contractor and wounded 4 U.S. soldiers. The Iranian-backed militia says 25 of its fighters were killed and 51 wounded in the American airstrike, including a regimental commander. The Iranian-backed militia, designated a terrorist group by the State Department in 2009, has vowed revenge on the roughly 5,000 U.S. troops currently deployed to Iraq. Earlier this month, after 2 rocket attacks on the Baghdad airport where U.S. troops are based, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned Iran's leaders, quote, "Any attacks by them or their proxies of any identity that harm Americans, our allies, or our interests will be answered with a decisive U.S. response." Now, the leader of this Iranian-backed militia is Abu Mohandas, a U.S.-designated terrorist responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait in 1983, 2 months after Beirut. But his militia fought against ISIS and is under the umbrella of the Iraqi security forces, complicating the situation, Eric.
All right. That's it, my royal family. Now, what I wanted to point out was during all the videos I played, I heard the number 11 twice. And in the Bible, the number 11 means chaos, disorder, and judgment. And that is quite fitting. It really is. So this is going to be deep, how this is going to go down. Because if they go full tilt war, and we got an election season, it's a lot of moving parts going on. You know, and then Trump being impeached, and they talking about he might get impeached again. I'm like, damn. I mean, the things that are happening, we're living really in some deep times. And that's why I always keep encouraging the royal family to look at everything with your spiritual eyes. Because we, you know, with us being chosen and being empathic, and not putting all of our emotions up in certain things, we are able to decipher what's really going on spiritually. And our Father, at the end of the day, he know that we are taking heed to the universe, and he will give the royal family those messages. So we shall see how it goes down. And one more thing. When I was reading off of my laptop, there was one scripture in here I read, and That is actually Micah. And it clicked in my head. I said that wrong. That was Micah. So, I encourage folks to really put those scriptures in there, because I'm interested in y'all input. Because I go back and I read these things. It's very serious with me. I mean, 100% in this spiritual walk. And I just want to have more clarity and understanding. And I'm a person that thrives off of prophecy, because I understand it. And it's just like I said, I just want to know where we're at and what's the next step. But still, with all of that, like I said, the last thing I want to say is that when we're seeing these benchmarks and we're knowing, according to the word, what's going to happen, there are some things we need to do. Now, I did say we needed to get our house in order, but we need to continue to minister to family and friends, because people are still in a state of confusion. And that's why we have to be very firm, because they're going to seek you out. You know, they might say this and that, but as they see these different events going on, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, so-and-so said blah, blah, blah. And I noticed they've been very consistent for many, many years, and they have not wavered. You know, we have not wavered, standing very firm on our position and not partaking in Esau's world. We must survive, and I think we do a pretty good job. A lot of us not partaking in that, because ultimately in the end, being chosen, we have to be very careful where we direct our energy. We are a sacred people, and we need to start treating our individual self sacred. And then there's things that we simply cannot partake in and simulate. We see simulating never worked. And our Father was not going to allow us to simulate. We're special, we're beautiful and divine. And I'm going to keep saying that to the royal family. And make sure you tell those royals that. Let them know they're excellent. Let them know we need you. Because more and more people will get visions, and those royals will get those visions. And I'm just telling you from something that I know, because I was one of them children. And I thank Yahweh for placing a certain people in my life, adults that raised me up, that would listen to this unusual child. And it's many of us. It's beautiful being unique and not simulating in this cesspool. So anyway, my royal family, render your voice with your beautiful divine words. And it's always, my royal family, I thank you for your love. I thank you for your support. And with that said, Ashe.